my voice was up to the performance. I have a cold I came down with just before leaving the country last week to go to a family wedding in Sydney, and haven't had a cold for about 5 years, and I know now I enjoy being healthy, and we'll see how whether my voice copes for the duration. But what I'm talking about today is partially just this issue of the role of government should they run surpluses, because if you read the popular press, if you read what the political manifestos, not just of the Conservatives but also Labor, you find this emphasis upon good management is running a surplus. And I want to pull that apart in various ways. But I want to start with explaining where this focus upon running budget surpluses came from, because quite frequently conventional economists, that includes people like Paul Krugman, will justifiably say that this isn't what we believe. We, meaning what he calls the Keynesian school, I call it the Samuelsonian school, because it bears no resemblance to what Keynes wrote, but it's Paul Samuelson's reinterpretation of Keynes, aided and abetted by the young John Hicks. But that particular interpretation comes up with arguments in favour of running the government deficit. But economics is a strange creature. That's a pretty much an obvious statement in this room. The mainstream has a very extreme stylised version, which these days, if they want to describe themselves, they call themselves new classicals, which imagines a world which works perfectly without government, perfectly with no collusion, perfectly without unions, etc., etc. Okay, if you remove all these, what they call imperfections, you get a perfect world. And that extreme version, people like Krugman fight in the political process, because they say, well, they actually agree that if they could get a world like the new classicals believe in, then it would be perfect. But they say, since we don't have this world, therefore the conclusions you make don't follow, and therefore, rather than austerity, we should run budget deficits during a downturn, etc., etc. But fundamentally, people from the progressive end of the mainstream, like Paul Krugman, use the same tools that are developed by these ultra-conservatives. And I want to show you the ultimate ultra-conservative guy called Robert Barrow, because his fantasy, and there's no better way to describe it, there probably is, but I'm in polite company, was what he called Ricardian equivalence. And this fantasy lies behind the austerity programs that you see built into the nature of the Maastricht Treaty and built into how the European Union is treating Greece and so on. He called it Ricardian equivalence. Now, one little guide, when anybody ever uses the name of a famous economist that has used one of their terms, well, I could use another impolite term. It's almost always bullshit. I will use that term. So he called this Ricardian equivalence based on the argument that you could find these propositions in David Ricardo. And in a couple of passages you can find Ricardo saying this and qualifying it later, but this is what he called the Ricardian approach to budget deficits, written back in 1989. And he just followed the logic here, because one of Keynes's wonderful statements in talking about, I believe, Hayek, was to talk about how one of Hayek's books shows what could happen when a fearsome logician working from false premises ends up in Bedlam. And that's what's going on here. So he said a deficit finance cut in current taxes leads to higher future taxes. That's a proposition. Okay? Followed by a cut in taxes must, I've emphasised it, but that's in the text, must be matched by a corresponding increase in the present value of future taxes. Therefore, in other words, to drop taxes now, taxes must rise in the future. Equally the same story about government spending. More government spending now means less spending in the future, or means more taxes in the future. Suppose, now one of my students once pointed out that when an economist says assume, what they actually mean is the word pretend. Suppose now that household demands for goods depends upon the expected present value of taxes. You're being led through a whole series of logical steps here. Okay? So we're now supposed to believe that your current consumption depends upon future expected taxes. Therefore, this is from false propositions to Bedlam. So the substitution of a budget deficit for current taxes has no impact on aggregate demand for goods. In other words, you can impose austerity and have no impact on current demand, because a current budget deficit leads to an offsetting increase in desired private savings. So if there's a budget deficit now, the public will instantly save in response to that. So the government spending increases because of the deficit, private spending falls because the private sector saves, No change in national demand, national saving, national demand. Okay. Now, if we assume, because people pointed out to him that he assumed you had infinite living individuals. And he said, oh, well, yes, okay, we don't have those, but if we assume that a network of intergenerational transfers makes the typical person part of an extended family that goes on indefinitely, okay, households capitalise the entire array of expected future taxes and therefore plan effectively with an infinite horizon. In other words, your spending today is based on what you think is going to happen to your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren's expenditure. Now, the reason that I wrote Debunking Economics, by the way, there's a second edition published in 2010, not quite as old as that and rather more updated, and I covered a fair bit of the economic issues after the financial crisis as well in that later edition. But this vision won't be found if you read the textbooks, because the textbooks writers, who generally speaking believe this same nonsense, but have better, again I'll use the French term, bullshit detectors, than the original authors like Samuelson and Barrow and so on, sanitise it. They write this stuff in various ways that seems more reasonable. Okay? They would not say that people plan for an infinite future. They'd say something else. We take into future expenditure, etc., to justify the same conclusion. You have to read the original articles to find this, and because it's bedded with mathematics, most people who are critics of the area don't even look at them. And that's a mistake, because you have to read the originals to know where this nonsense comes from. Now, what he's asserting, of course, is families plan for an infinite future. So if you have an increase in a government deficit today, pardon me, pressing the wrong button here, you necessarily, people save more to give bequests to their great-great-great-great-grandchildren. I'm not joking, that's effectively what the argument is. So that they can pay future taxes. So because you know future taxes are going to rise, because of the deficit you save to let your grandchildren pay those taxes off. It is sheer, absolute nonsense. You basically have to ask, what on earth was he smoking? You know? I think most of these people have studied at the University of Amsterdam. And there's two totally delusional elements to the reasoning here. First of all, they talk about what they call rational agents. Now, if you look at how they define the word rational, and you took their definition without the word itself, and gave that to a person in the street and said, what word in the dictionary is being defined by this expression? The expression is, this person has a model that can accurately predict the future. So people say, oh, you're defining Nostradamus, aren't you, or God? That's the capacity for prophecy. That's what they call rational expectations. And Barrow was also involved in that particular farce as well. In fact, he even admitted, he actually has said in one of his academic papers that the cleverest thing about what he called the rational expectations revolution was, and I quote, the appropriation of the word rational. They stole it from the dictionary and redefined it. So now when they say rational, which you think is a sensible thing, they're meaning prophetic, which is simply impossible. But on the basis that everybody's believed to be prophetic, that's why they reject the sensible arguments you make, because you're only rational. Okay? And there's also a non-monetary vision of ego-capitalism, and it's an equilibrium vision. Because you go up now, you must go down in the future. Everything's about a balance. And this comes out of the mechanistic philosophy that dominated the interpretation of physics that the 19th century neoclassical economist aped back in the 1870s and so on. People like Walras, Jevons, to some extent Marshall, were aping what they thought was a state of physics at the time they wrote. Best person on this is Philip Mirowski. If you'd read any of Philip Mirowski's works, you'll see the extent to which they really were trying to reproduce the successes of physics and economics. It was also breaking away from Marx and so on, but a large part of it was this belief in this mechanistic version, and Philip describes their vision as what he called energetics, which was a vision of the role of energy and balance and harmony in mechanical systems prior to the discovery of thermodynamics and prior, of course, to quantum mechanics and so on. So that vision has become embedded in their way of thinking, and they don't believe you can model the economy except in it leaving it's in equilibrium, and of course they leave money out of it completely. So for this non-monetary vision, money in that sense, it's a barter system. You might designate some particular commodity to be the intermediary in barter, but it's basically a barter system. It's saying the government, to manage that equilibrium, pardon me, Over time, it must run a balanced budget. Wrong button again. And that's why they argue for austerity now. I'm sure Cameron doesn't quite appreciate this. I hope not. If he appreciated this and is doing it, he's totally mad. But of course, you can see the same thing on the Labor Party side as well. So the actual proposition can't possibly work. The idea that you can have in Europe, they actually argued for a while when they imposed austerity on places like Greece and Spain. Part of their argument was that this would be expansionary. Okay, not just that they had the balancing argument in there as well, saying when the government sector reduces spending, the private sector will spend more. So they said running a surplus will stimulate private spending. Rather than saying it would just be a matching increase, they'd say, "I'll make people so much more confident," they'd increase spending. So they talked about expansionary fiscal consolidation. Tell that to the Greeks and Spanish today. Now, this is the basis of the European Union's beliefs. I'll talk about Greece here, but of course the arguments I'm making here are comparable to what would happen if you imposed austerity in England today as well, which of course is the argument. The most recent budget of Cameron has backed off quite dramatically from the level of austerity and the level of surplus he's trying to achieve. But the philosophical bias that they should run a surplus is still there. Now, when you look at what the Troika imposed on Greece, they were requiring a sustained government surplus of 4.5% of GDP. And at the same time, they had the objective that the nominal rate of growth should be 3%. Now, I want to point out just how impossible that combination is. But what's going on there? They're seeing, effectively the government is being seen as a household or a business. And the argument goes that businesses should be profitable, which means their revenue in should be less than their expenditure out. And that's the same sort of idea you're imposing on the government, that same sort of vision. And if you do it long enough, you'll be profitable and the economy will boom. And I have a wonderful cartoonist producing a cartoon version of Debunking Economics, a guy called Miguel Guerra. Does a group called Seven Robots. And you've got a beautiful cartoon satire. I hope you can read the text there. Probably a bit too small. But this is Merkel berating Yanis Varoufakis with the Troika singing a Greek choir in the background. And she's saying to him, "You're going to take this new debt and use it to pay off your already soul-crushing, insurmountable debt. And when you haven't got a prayer of ever recovering, bam, that's when prosperity happens. Why can't you see it?" Okay. I want to take a strictly monetary look at this whole idea that running a surplus is a good idea for a government. And this is sort of thought experiment that I hope you'll find it's something you could actually use with friends who still fall for the argument that a surplus is a good idea, because superficially it makes sense because people think instantly of the government as if it's like a household. And that's the reason this particular fallacy falls into people's minds so easily. So divide society into two halves, government and private. Draw a box in your mind. I'm going to show you a rectangle on the screen in a short while, but draw a rectangle in your mind and divide it in two and call one half the government, the other half the private sector. Well, the surplus means the flow of government taxes is greater than the flow of government spending. So that means that there's a net flow of money from the private sector in that box to the government sector. So you've got a flow going from private to government in your box. Call that net gov. Okay? If that's going to be positive on the government side, it's got to be precisely the same negative on the private side. Okay? This is a point that modern monetary theory has been making for a while. So if you want to have the government running a surplus, it means the private sector has to run a deficit, which means rather than the government saving, inverted commas, enabling you to save more, it actually, to them to save, they've got to be taking money out of your bank accounts. Whether they're saving or not, you certainly aren't under the influence of that. That's the first stage. So what you've got is a transfer of money going through. Now, that means, in the case of what the Troika's imposed on Greece, that the flow of money going from the private sector to the government must be equivalent to 4.5% of GDP per year. Now, where can you get the money? I'm writing a post on my Forbes column right now, which I'm calling How to Make Money. A bit of a satire because, most people think make money, the idea is invent a better mousetrap. And you'll make money that way. No, you don't make money by inventing a better mousetrap. You make money by printing it somehow. And of course, if we try to do that, we get thrown in jail. Okay? So the government can print money, but the other group that can print money is the private banking sector. So if you have this sort of flow going on, then on a one-off basis, it's not impossible. It can be done occasionally. a one-off flow. The Troika is talking about 10 or 15 years of a surplus of that scale. But it still means the opposite of what they believe, because it means a flow of money from the private sector to the government, reducing the money in the private sector. But if you have to provide that flow indefinitely, there's only two ways to do it. Either you reduce your bank balances fall by the equivalent of 4.5% of GDP per annum, or you borrow that money from the banks. So you've now got to take that rectangle and divide half of it in two again, and make one half the banking sector and the other half the non-bank private sector. And the loans being issued by the banks to the private non-bank sector have to be, to keep the amount of money in the private sector constant, have to also be 4.5% of GDP per annum. Okay? So call that net bank. And what you've got going on, a deficit from the banking sector's point of view, meaning they're financing the private non-bank sector, and that money is being transferred to the government. Now, if you put that together, if it's just so what you borrow is exactly equivalent to what the government wants to run as a surplus, that means the private sector's level of debt is growing by 4.5% of GDP per annum. Now, that's a way of thinking at the moment which only has a constant amount of money in the economy. Okay? Because money flowing in, money flowing out, the same constant amount. You can't get 3% growth out of that situation unless the rate of turnover of money is rising by 3% per annum. Okay? Now, we know that that isn't happening, because when you look at the historical data, if you had a constant money stock, the velocity is actually falling. This is a historical chart from the very good database the St. Louis Federal Reserve runs. And this is what they call money of zero maturity, which is probably the best guide to an accurate measure of the basic money stock. And that shows that the rate of turnover of money used to be twice per annum, rose to a peak of being money turning over 3.5 times per annum during the 1980s, and then has been on a downward trend ever since. It's probably heading down towards 1. So the rate of turnover of money is declining, and it actually falls during recessions. So rather than that sort of spending being compensated by an increasing velocity of money, it's likely to be made worse, okay, because the velocity of circulation is also likely to slow down. So if you have a government surplus where the surplus is completely financed by the private sector borrowing money off the banks to pay for it, at best you get no economic growth. More likely you're going to get an economic contraction if it's a slowdown in velocity as well. And you're going to have a rising ratio of private debt to GDP. And that example I'm using now, the rate of growth of debt being 4.5% of GDP per annum, the rate of GDP growth at best being 0, you're getting a rising private debt burden. So the only way to get growth with a government surplus like that is for the private sector to borrow more money than it needs to pay to the government as well. So if you want to have a growing economy, while you've got the government running a surplus at the same time, then the private sector has to be borrowing money at a greater rate than the government's running a surplus, which means, yes, you can get growth out of that, but the rate of growth of debt is faster still. GDP may well grow for a while. Of course, we know most of that growth is going to be focused in asset price inflation, because that's where most of that borrowed money goes. But you're going to have a faster rate of growth of debt than GDP, faster than in the case of no growth, which I began with there. So in the medium term, if you sustained a government deficit for something like, say, 5 or 10 years, seeing the government as a causal factor here, you have a rising private debt to GDP ratio and ultimately an economic crisis. Because at some stage the private sector simply won't borrow any more money, the banks won't lend any more money, the whole thing goes into reverse. So a government surplus is a great way of causing a future economic crisis. Now, if you're lucky, it happens when your opponents have taken over government, and you can blame them for it, which is certainly what happened in Australia, okay, and to some extent happened here as well. In that case, the Conservatives blaming Labor for the crisis. But they're both following the same sorts of policies. So you simply can't avoid having the private sector trying to reduce debt in that situation at some point. Now, when it does, you then have money being sucked out of the economy in two ways. If the government tries to continue running austerity in that process, the government's taking money out at the rate of 4.5% of GDP per annum in the example I've shown from Greece. The private sector starts to delever as well. Your money supply can fall by 10 or 15% per annum. And that's what's happening in Greece. Now, everybody's focusing on the level of Greek public debt. And yes, the Greek public debt is a problem because it's not a sovereign state and because it's nowhere near as economically vibrant an economy as it would need to be to support the level of debt that it has and the level of government spending and so on. But this is this correlation I'll show you multiple times in the presentation today between the change in debt, private debt, and the level of unemployment. And fundamentally, change in private debt is what drives the level of economic activity. So if you have a period of a boom here, as you see on the left-hand scale, it gives you the red line, which is the rate of change of private debt compared to GDP on an annual basis, peaked at about pretty close to 20% of GDP back in 2008. Then it's been downhill ever since, and after 2011, the private sector in Greece has been reducing its debt levels by of the order of 12% of GDP per year. Now, if you throw on top of that Troika's insistence that they reduce, the government runs a surplus as well of 4.5%. You're talking sucking about 1/6 of the money supply out of the economy every year. And they want it to grow at the same time. Simply impossible. Now, when you're in that situation, let's just imagine you have a crisis like we had, what England had and Australia had and so on in America. What happened in those cases was the government went into a massive deficit. It was the sensible thing to do. It's also what automatically tends to happen because tax revenues fall, government spending rises. That attenuates it. But if you have the situation that Europe has imposed upon itself of the private sector deleveraging and the government continuing to attempt to run a surplus, then you have a complete contraction in the economy because the money supply is falling and the velocity of turnover of money is also collapsing. So what you get, the only way to balance the whole thing is the private sector has to contract. So it's a recipe for a depression. And that's what the Troika has imposed upon Spain and imposed on Greece, obviously, and most of southern Europe in the name of economic recovery. This is how dangerous this non-monetary equilibrium way of thinking is. Now, what's balancing out to some extent is having depressed their economy so much, their imports have fallen so much, exports have risen a tiny amount, they're now getting a surplus. I'm seeing it as a deficit here from the foreign sector's point of view, but they're running a trade surplus of some description which attenuates it. But the entire basis of being able to recover from the pain they're being put through is this internal devaluation to make them so-called more internationally competitive, which means cheaper place for Northern Europeans to have holidays if they'd ever dare turning up there right now, but also importing far less. But, of course, the fastest way to do that would be to devalue. But they can't because they're tied up in the euro. So this fetish upon a surplus is mistaking the role of the government and seeing the government as being like a household or like a business. But there's one simple way of proving that a government is not like a household and like a business, and that is, can you name me one household or one business which can make money? Okay. None. Okay. What the government is like a bank. And just in thinking in general terms, not in terms of an economic crisis now, but with a growing economy, banks create money by lending, and for an economy to grow, you would want loans to be greater than repayments over time, growing in such a rate that you have a reasonable ratio of debt to GDP not going out of control, which obviously is not what we've had happen in the real world. But banks generally create more money by loans than they cancel by repayments. So you want banks to be expanding the money supply in that sense. You want the government to be doing the same thing as well. We're in a mixed economy. Now what's being done here is by falsely seeing the government as like a household, they're saying let the banks expand the money and we're going to contract it at the same time. And therefore throw the burden of financing that onto the private sector borrowing from the private banks, which leads to the sort of bubbles and crises we've seen in England, all around the world. So the only sustainable situation in the long term, and it's not perfect either, is government should normally run deficits. Because looking at it this way, you have bank lending injecting money into the private sector, deficit spending injecting money into the private sector, in general, of course there can be some countries that run trade surpluses from their point of view very effectively over time, but of course one surplus is another country's deficit, so overall that's balanced at the global level. That's your balanced situation. So it's sensible in a growing economy for a government to run a deficit most of the time. The target should not be a balanced budget, it should be a deficit, something of the order of the rate of growth of nominal GDP. That should be the sensible target. Now if you imagine that was being done, it's because it is being done by default quite frequently, because governments try to run surpluses and then find they simply can't cut the services enough to do that, continue berating themselves for failing, but they're failing an impossible and stupid agenda. It's actually good that they're failing. It's disastrous when they succeed. So Barrow reached the opposite conclusion to the one I've led you through here, because the neoclassical heartland, I'll say the mainstream here, but the real heartland of neoclassical economics, ignores banks' debt and money completely. They don't even think in monetary terms. This is one of the bizarre things for somebody who hasn't been trained as an economist and just thinks that an economist is an expert on the economy, like an engineer is an expert on building bridges, and therefore, obviously, because economy is about money, then economists must be expert on money, just like an engineer must be an expert on cement. The trouble is, economists are experts on dreaming up reasons. This is why you don't need to consider money in modelling the economy. It's a delusional discipline, unfortunately. And I want to give you an example of that. It comes from what's called the loanable funds fallacy, and that sees money, doesn't really understand where money comes from. It sees money as this, like a commodity we can all hoard. Somewhere it's produced, effectively it's like a gold model in that sense. You know, if you don't have enough money in their vision of the world, you've got two ways of getting it. You can work harder, or you can go dig a hole somewhere and find some gold. Okay? It's not like the real world where you've got to work harder or borrow money from a bank. And this is Paul Krugman putting it in his book, End This Depression Now. He says, think of it this way, when debt is rising, it's not the economy as a whole borrowing more money. That's precisely wrong. It is the economy as a whole borrowing more money. But I want to show you his vision in a model that I've built to model the economy dynamically that I call Minsky. Because in getting through these people why they're wrong and letting others see why it's wrong, it's really useful to put their vision into a comprehensible format, a modelling format. So he says, borrowing is simply a case of less patient people borrowing from more patient people. Well, the reality is, and this is the Bank of England recently came out and said this beautifully in a paper published back in the beginning of last year called Money Creation in the Modern Economy. Has anybody seen that paper? Yeah, quite a few. I recommend reading. It's a very beautifully written piece of work. Really, it could almost be addressed to Paul Krugman. And believe me, I know the authors. It could have been addressed to Paul Krugman, trying to get through to people like him, saying that no, what goes on when banks make a loan, they simultaneously create a matching deposit, thereby creating new money. Now, it's also creating new demand, and I want to show you that impact as well using my software package Minsky. By the way, this is a software package which is open source. Its development has been stopped because I haven't been able to get more funding for it for a while. It's something you can donate to on my blog through my debt deflation blog straight to the programmer who writes the code. So if you'd like to see things like this being improved, please go to my blog and click on that link to support Russell Standish's programming work. But what this program does, it's what's called a class of software called system dynamics. Has anybody heard of system dynamics here? A few. Again, that's another area, again, I recommend people learning because the economy is a complex system and no one can see or understand the economy. You have to work with a model of it in your head. The model that neoclassicals have got is this equilibrium barter model that leaves out all the complexities, all the feedbacks, all the dynamics. And to actually get those properly, you have to have a way of organising that all in your head. And a software package like Minsky lets you do that. There's many others out there, packages like, those of you who know the field would know of VenSim, or maybe Simulink if you're in engineering. Packages that retail for $3,000, $4,000 a copy. Things like that. This one is free. But what they don't have the capacity for is modelling the banking sector. So what I've done is create a software package. I've done the design. I haven't done the programming. It's been Russell Standish's work. But I've designed this program to enable us to model the monetary system using the tool that accountants invented half a millennium ago of double-entry bookkeeping. So I'm not sure how much you can see from that. Unfortunately, it would be better with a much larger screen. I can see a couple of people getting sore eyes back there. Okay. But what this is showing, each of these columns is an account. So this particular account is reserves, bank reserves. The next one is CD, stands for consumer deposit account, consumer sector, in terms of the sector producing consumer goods. Investment sector, a workers' deposit account, and bankers' equity account. And what I'm showing here is the vision of lending that people like Paul Krugman have, where it's not a case of banks lending to non-banks, it's a case of one patient agent lending to another impatient agent. And in the paper that Krugman published with Egerton in the Quarterly Journal of Economics in 2012, in the appendix, they had a model, they had what they called a bank. Now, I don't regard what they had as a bank as anything like what a real bank is, but I can build a version of their idea in a real banking model, which is what Minsky gives me here. So what they had was lending from the consumer sector to the investment sector. And then the investment sector repaying that debt, then paying interest on the debt, which is why the consumer sector made the loan. And the role of the bank is simply to arrange the loan between the two parties, and to finance itself, it charges a fee to the consumer sector. So in this case, the consumer sector is paying a fee across to the bank, and that's how the bank makes money. Then you have the workers consuming, workers being hired by both sectors buying inputs off each other, workers consuming, bankers consuming, and bankers investing. So that's the basic logic there. And what I then show is the same situation from the point of view of each of the other, the investment sector's idea, the consumption sectors, and the workers. Now, if I run this model, simulated over time, you're seeing the growth rate here. You'll see it's extremely close to zero. In fact, the growth rate is now stabilised at 0.19% per annum, which is, of course, a massively vibrant economy. No growth going on. You can see GDP is flatlining down here at about 200. Now, in this situation, I'm going to change the rate of lending and see what happens. So I'm going to make lending happen more rapidly. Little dip in the growth rate. Make repayment happen more slowly. Another little dip in the growth rate. Notice the level of debt rising dramatically there. And you can just see in the bottom down here, this is what I'm looking forward to computed resolutions for screens like this improving over time so I can show everything on screen at once. The debt ratio is rising past 100%. Massive increase in the debt ratio. What's happened to GDP? Almost nothing. Now, if I go from very fast lending to very slow lending, bit of a dip in GDP there, and a very fast rate of repayment, you can see the debt level here plunging dramatically. I'll let it go on for a while and let it stabilise in a moment. Few changes to GDP. But the simulation has now been running for 48 years. Okay. GDP hasn't moved all that much. I'll just stop it now and just move it down and show you the debt ratio. I'm just trying to point out why they ignore the level of private debt. So the debt ratio rose from about 20% of GDP to about 110% and back down to 20% again. And not much happened to GDP. So in this sense, what they're arguing about you can ignore debt is logically consistent within their model of the economy. It's only one problem, their model is wrong. So what I want to do is now go back to the beginning again and say, well, let's just make this more realistic, because what this model is arguing is that the debt is actually an asset of the consumer sector. The consumer sector lends to the investment sector. That's nonsense. So what I can do in Minsky is delete that entry and say the debt's not an asset for the consumer sector. Yes, of course, there's some lending between non-bank agents, but most lending is by banks to non-banks. So I'm going to delete that column. Minsky now tells me I've got unbalanced rows here. I'm going to delete the lending and repayment operations which don't occur between the consumer sector and the investment sector, and delete the bank fee. And I'm going to change the net worth of the consumer sector because it doesn't have the asset of the loan. It's got 10 less as an initial level than was shown there. And if I just go back up to the top again here, I'm going to change what lending is based upon as well, and base lending upon the level of debt rather than on the deposit account of the consumer sector. It's always a bit hard. This is one of the things that programming is all about, trying to get the coding improved so it's easy to get that little circle you can see there so I can capture and drag a line down. I don't know how many, any computer programmers in the room? One? You know what it's like, don't you? You've got to pixelate. I'm trying to get that little dot. And with my, I should have another mouse attached so I can reach it more clearly, but I'm in the section where I'm moving the, there we go, great. Got that done. And I'm now going to go across to the banking sector and say, well, in fact, notice that the operations here are not balanced. This thing here has to sum to zero. That's the great advantage of double entry bookkeeping. It makes sure you keep everything balanced. So if I add an extra column here, and I say, what are the available... Oh, what happened there? I deleted a column. Oh, no. My cold getting in the way. I just deleted reserves. That's really helpful. Hang on a second. Okay, so this will be a real challenge. Can I fix this up? Okay, now I want to move that over this. This is really a challenge with my cold. Okay, so I've got that over there. Now say, what are the assets in the system that haven't been allocated? This should... I've stuffed it, I'm afraid. I've got rid of the reserves without meaning to. Fortunately, I've got a backup. But what I was about to do is show you can rapidly change from that model to this model. So I'll bring it up here. I've done those changes before I came here. So what I've simply done is say that the debt is an asset of the banking sector. Okay? Lending and repayment. Lending increases the debt, repayment reduces it, interest payments are made to the banking sector. And now what happens when I change the rate of growth of lending? For a start, you'll see the economy actually grows overall. There's a positive growth rate there. Then if I have an increase in the rate of lending, notice the rate of growth increases. Notice GDP is rising here too, by the way. The slowdown in the rate of repayment, growth rate rises further still. And then if I have a slowdown in the rate of lending and an increase in the rate of repayment, notice your GDP is headed south. Now I'll go back to the initial stage where repayments, lending took about 7 years to double and repayments took about 9 years to double. But we've now had a boom and a slump in the economy. Now that's the role that debt has. Debt generates new demand and new income when it's first borrowed into existence. So the rate of change of debt plays a crucial role in the level of economic activity. And that's completely omitted, again on the basis of a lousy set of assumptions. Okay? And we've said, whenever you see economists saying, let's assume, put the words, let's pretend. So by leaving that out of their thinking, they're ignoring probably the most important factor in the nature of the growth of the economy. It's tragic, but that's what they're doing. They actually ignore the most important factors. Well, I spotted the error that caused that problem when I was doing the presentation, so here's the same idea again. What I've got here is I've added government spending and government taxation to the model very simply. So I've got the government getting loans from the central bank, because that's looking at entirely government finance spending, not looking at loans and so on. It's a very, very simple idea. And that money is spent, I've got the government spending being on the workers and taxation being on the consumer sector. Just the sheer simplicity in basing the level of loans on the current level of spending on the current level of government loans, and they can be controlled dynamically while the simulation is running. So we're in the simulation now, and I don't have any, if I have the rate of government spending being the same as the rate of government taxation, then you slowly see the debt ratio falling over time. If the government runs a permanent permanent balanced budget here, then it'll ultimately have this debt level heading towards zero compared to the scale of the economy, GDP growing, etc., etc. Now let's see if we try to improve things by running a surplus. So I'll go back and start the model again. And now we have government spending happening more slowly. And you then notice what happened. There's now a government surplus, but the government's growth rate actually fell to be negative. Do it again. More negative. Okay, so spending more slowly by the government, which is actually helping you reduce government debt, is actually slowing the economy down. Go in the opposite direction. Let's try by, say, increasing the tax rate, so taxing more rapidly. Again, the same sort of basic dynamics. So by running a surplus, you actually take money out of the economy and cause it to grow more slowly. The only compensating effect can come if you have a faster rate of lending, which goes in the opposite direction. But that's what the government's mistake for themselves is doing good economic management, when in fact what's going on is normally the financial sector is financing a housing bubble, and that gives government revenue, which makes the government think it's doing a good thing until such time as the housing bubble bursts and the economy collapses. if I decided to increase the surplus, the growth rate dropped. Okay? This is the great dilemma, because you're taking money out of the economy. Okay? You're telling the economy to grow while you're taking money out of it. It's not going to happen. Okay? You can be balanced by other factors at different times. In England, of course, you're balanced by a huge property bubble and by the inflow of foreign money buying houses here, and so on. Those sorts of factors. But the basic effect of running a surplus is to slow down the economy. It doesn't cause it to grow faster. So that's the myth of believing that the surplus is a positive thing. It actually will diminish the rate of growth of the economy because it's diminishing the money supply, which is fundamentally one of the two two major roles the government has, is expanding the money supply with non-debt-based money. Now, what I've been talking about here is the government deciding to run a set of policies that leads to a crisis. But the causal mechanism is normally reversed in the real world. That is, the government believes it should run a surplus, but can't manage to do it unless there's a bubble in the private sector. You have the private banks lending for an asset bubble like this dot-com bubble back in the 1990s or the subprime bubble in America in 2000s. And that enables the government to run a surplus because so much extra tax is being collected. And so many people are working as real estate agents selling second-hand houses to each other that there's an increase in the revenue and salaries and so on, a decrease in government spending. And the government thinks it's doing great economic management until the economy crashes. But of course, not knowing this particular way, we go back get into the same crisis at the other stage. And this has been happening when you take a look at the global economy since 1990, because Japan first entered into this crisis in 1990. Japan's economy actually peaked in terms of its Nikkei index and its overall bubble economy on the very last day of 1989. December 31st, 1989 was the peak for the Nikkei index. It was downhill ever since. When you look at the economy, you see this rising level of private debt, continuing to rise after the crisis, and rising government debt from this stage. Of course, everybody focuses upon the level of government debt. Did anybody before seeing this slide know that the level of private debt in Japan was roughly 175% of GDP? Okay. Don't even talk about it, do we? Fortunately, the Bank of International Settlements now collects this data. So if you want to find this data yourselves, go to the Bank of International Settlements. That's the only international agency that redeemed itself by actually warning of the crisis before it happened, with its research director, Bill White, being a great fan of Hyman Minsky and trying to get these views through the central banks. And even though he's staring Greenspan in the face, failing, of course, to convince Greenspan, but also not being intimidated by Greenspan, which all to Bill's credit. But that's the situation. Look at that pattern. You're going to see much the same pattern for the other two countries I'm going to show you, including England. Now, when you look at the rate of change of debt, you then see what the causal mechanism is. Because the red line is the rate of change of private debt, which peaked at about over 25% of GDP, and then was plunged down from that level. Remember, that's much like the chart I showed you for Greece beforehand. And what I'm graphing here is unemployment. I'm graphing it on the right-hand axis, and as I did for Greece, I've turned unemployment upside down. So 1% is here for Japan and 6% is down here. So you can see the correlation. But a large part of demand in a capitalist economy is credit financed, debt financed. And therefore, and because that's the most volatile part of demand, you get a very strong relationship between the change in debt and the level of economic activity, which of course turns up in the unemployment rate. That correlation, for those who know their statistics, minus 0.91 over, what is that, 55 years, 50 years? That's a fairly significant statistic. You'd think I'd get economists fascinated by that. I can't even get them to look at it, because so far as they're concerned, it shouldn't be there. And the excellent statement that a colleague copied me by from Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, where Kahneman talked about what he called theory-induced blindness. He said he's been guilty of it himself, which is intriguing. But if people don't have a theory that explains something, you can show it to them right in their faces and they will not see it because their theory says it can't be there. So you had 15 years now of deleveraging. From this point on, actually a decade of genuine deleveraging, private debt falling. Okay. But not falling enough to reduce the ratio because GDP itself hasn't been rising. GDP in nominal terms has been falling as well. So the ratio is stabilised. And the ups and downs of unemployment in Japan have followed that pattern. This is the USA. I'm including total debt here because I think there's a strong case to be said there's too much debt of all sorts and we should be actually writing it off rather than seeing necessarily government debt to cancel out private debt. But that's the same sort of story. Notice the government debt rises after the crisis. Private debt rises before, continues to rise for a while and then falls. Then when you look at the rate of change of debt, I think the American economy is the best example here because it's the most self-contained economy on the planet. Even with its level of foreign trade, its trade deficit is covered by its income surplus from ownership of assets in the rest of the world. So it tends to be probably the best example of a hermetically sealed economy. And this is the relationship between change in debt and the level of unemployment in America since 1990. Again, a correlation coefficient. If you actually wanted to find it, you'd weep at finding a number that high. Because they don't want to find it, they don't even see that number, minus 0.93. Again, I've turned the unemployment rate upside down here so you can see the correlation more clearly. So they went from the stage of having the change in debt contributing 15% of GDP as additional demand before the crisis, down to subtracting 5% per annum at the depth of the crisis. But they turned around very rapidly, and they're now back to the stage where the change in private debt is adding about 5% of GDP to demand per year, demand and income. And the UK is similar, much more volatile, I might add. This particular chart includes financial sector debt. The top line is actually the one the ONS publishes, which includes the debt of the financial sector to the banks. Astronomical. I think it's probably the highest in the world. And it gives you much more volatility in your debt pattern than you find in America or Japan as well. The blue line is the comparable data for what I've shown you for America and Japan so far. Still high. You peaked at about 200% of GDP. Again, the same basic pattern. Private debt rising, continued to rise till after the crisis for a while, and then heading down. Government debt only rising after the crisis begins. When I look at the change in debt, it's much more volatile for England than it is for America or Japan, but the same basic relationship applies fairly strongly again. Change in private debt, peaking, collapsing after the crisis, and periods of deleveraging. When I include the financial sector debt, which is hard to measure because often the financial sector debt lumps together bank lending and non-bank lending, similar pattern. It says that on occasions, I still find this a stunning figure, nothing like this for any other country on the planet, including financial sector debt. It's saying that the change in financial sector debt in 2009 was roughly 60% of GDP. It's just, I'm just amazed. I can't imagine how that happened. But that's the level of leverage and gambling that goes on in what you call the city. Now, when you look globally, one reason why we're in I think an existential crisis now, it isn't just something like the 1930s even, but it's existential, is that we have the highest level of debt in recorded history. I put this data together by taking Federal Reserve data from 1945 on and then attaching that to earlier census data in two particular time series that overlapped by substantial periods. Gave you very different patterns for the total level of debt, but it's like I've managed to move the definition of the Federal Reserve uses today back in time. And with that basis, you can see that private debt has been heading up from about 10% of GDP down there to 160% up here. This is a government debt sensor. The blue line is government debt to GDP, which is a recorded data series going right back to 1790 in America. But you can see that trend of rising level of leverage in the global economy. Whole lots of reasons behind it, including the ones I've shown you, others as well. So I think the only way out of this crisis is debt cancellation. And that was a common thing in pre-capitalist societies, debt jubilees. And we are smart enough to think we don't need them. Big mistake. So I think the only reason we haven't had as severe a crisis as Greece or Spain here is because of deficit spending, even though the government hasn't wanted to do it. So the government has attenuated the sort of crisis that I model when I model Minsky's financial instability hypothesis. This is a model of a pure government, a pure private sector economy with debt and with no government spending. And when I simulate this model, I get a period where it looks like the economy is heading towards a nice equilibrium if you ignore the level of debt to GDP, private debt, and that at some point this economy collapses because debt just becomes astronomical. So that's a basic dynamic I can talk about in more detail in discussion if you like. But that's the sort of dynamic we've got ourselves caught up in. So I think if we don't have debt cancellation, we're never going to get growth reaching the level that reached before the crisis, because a large part of growth is credit financed. And if you don't have that credit finance to begin with, you won't get the level of economic growth either. So we're going to see a tendency to fail to reach growth targets throughout, which will lead to governments trying to run larger surpluses, which will make it worse. Okay? When there's a crisis, they'll go back into running a deficit, political panic, particularly if an election is coming up. One reason you're unlucky to take 5 years between elections. It takes longer for them to panic. Because deleveraging is always going to be just around the corner. The private sector is going to be close to deleveraging at all times. All it will take is a level of government attempting to run a surplus again to trigger that deleveraging once more, as Japan's been doing for 25 years. We talk about the lost decade in Japan. It's now a lost quarter century. Now, Japan can cope with that for a whole lot of reasons, far better than the West can. It's a much more homogenous society, much more industrialised, and with a demographic with a declining population, which makes it actually easier to cope with this syndrome, and running a trade surplus with the rest of the world. None of those factors apply here. So the level of social breakdown you could expect to come out of that sort of pattern, particularly in Europe, but also America and England, is scary. So I give what I call the modern debt jubilee, and that's to use the state's capacity to create debt-free money. Make an injection directly into people's bank accounts, a direct cash injection, on condition that anybody who's in debt must pay their debt down. For those who don't have debt, get a cash injection, so you're not being penalised by not being in debt. It doesn't bring up that so-called moral hazard problem. You need to reform the banking sector, and I've said in other miracles there because I know how hard and how unlikely that is. Okay? But we want to restrict the lending on the basis of assets. We need banks to create money, but not for the sake of asset speculation. But that's all they do these days. I want them to finance the Dysons of the world, innovative entrepreneurs, that sort of behaviour. And so I want to find a way of limiting the extent to which they'll finance just assets. And one concept I've come up with, and I know there are problems with it, but I think it's a reasonable first start, is what I call the PIL. It's always important to find a good acronym. Particularly in England, I find you people are obsessed with acronyms. Property Income Limited Leverage. Now, of course, at the moment when you go for a loan, the bank allegedly relates the loan to the level of your income or the level of leverage you need to buy the property itself. Nonsense, of course. It's an elastic band. They stretch it as far as they can get away with. The whole HSBC crisis we've seen recently is a lovely example of that. So I'd like to bring in a second limit to say, OK, base it on the income of the borrower, but also set a maximum level based on the income of the asset being purchased. So, for example, in the case of a property, if a property rented for roughly what my property, the little apartment I've got in Waterloo, rents for about £16,000 a year, then the maximum leverage anybody should be able to borrow to buy that place should be, say, 10 times that rental income, 160,000 quid. I'm sure if that were the case, the price would be a lot lower.
That's how the accountants value the statements.
That's what we need to get to, and to make it enforced, and not give any ways around it, and not people borrowing other ways to get their deposits and so on. Yeah. And I want to end margin lending as well. It's one of the most destructive forms of gambling. It simply shouldn't be possible. We need to reform our share ownership as well, but certainly as a start would be ending margin lending completely. And we also want banks to lend to businesses, but lending to businesses is risky in the ultimate sense of the word. You might lend to 10 businesses, 9 of them will fail, or 9 business ventures will fail. One will succeed. Your downside is losing your principal 9 times. Your upside is getting interest on one loan. Okay? Now that's a strong discouragement for actually lending to business. You can see why banks resile from that and prefer to finance asset bubbles. Whether they know it or not, it appears to be, money for nothing. But if we actually want them to finance business, we have to give them a stake in those businesses, effectively the same as venture capital gets now. So this is only a very new idea, but I think we need to develop something that I'm calling EAL, entrepreneurial equity loans, which means banks, when they lend for those sorts of ventures, not for housing and obviously and things like that, when they lend, they're lending for a stake in the business, not just lending for an interest share. And then hopefully that can mean they can get that positive return they need to actually want to lend to create new ventures and new innovation, not asset bubbles. Thank you.